So, in the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras, we get to this kind of meaty part. And this meaty part walks out from those first two limbs of the Yoga Sutras that we talked about in a previous section. The Ashtanga Yoga, we have Yama and Niyama we start with those two sets of rules, those sets of ethical rules. And then this third step is Asana. And for many of us in the modern yoga tradition, that's where the meat is, right? We're asana practitioners, and this practice that we've adopted, that has evolved through the Middle Ages and in the early modern period into our day, we call it generally Hatha Yoga. And its main method, its main technique is asana. So we get that in Yoga Sutra. If we look at all of the Yoga Sutra, it's not describing a yoga that uses asana as a primary technology. It's a minor technology, and it has this very specific definition, but it's really fun to look at the way Patanjali looks at asana and what we can take from asana to understand how the focus on asana developed in the later tradition and how we might utilize Patanjali's really unique perspective on the practice, very basic perspective on the practice, for our own approach to asana and how that might lead to greater things, lead to greater consciousness. So the sutra we're dealing with in Yoga Sutra is 246 and 247. And 246 goes, Sthira Sukham Asanam. Three simple words. And in all of Yoga Sutra, we only have three verbs. So this is kind of the way that Patanjali throws words at us. He throws nouns at us, sort of like the Hebrew Bible. And we are given the opportunity to figure out the relationship among these words. So three very simple words. Sthira Sukham Asanam. What do those three words mean? So we often get st in the names of the poses, like Vasisthasana or Padangusthasana, sta. Sta means standing, and it is a root that we find shot throughout the whole Sanskrit lexicon. It's a very common phoneme that we find, and part of the reason it's so common is that it relates to the sense of noble standing, sense of warriorhood that we saw in the tradition in the pre-modern period, and it was key, actually, to the survival of those people. Yeah? So we often say that it was a patriarchal culture. It was a culture based on the power of the male, but it was the power of the male which sustained the livelihood of the society. It was a warrior culture. It was a culture in which the confrontation with nature was constant. And so it required vira, it required some focus, it required some standing, some capacity to draw power to one, to stand in the midst of that power and to exercise that power. So we have this idea of sthira, of standing nobly, of withstanding what comes towards you, and sort of to work with that phrase, that common phrase, stand and deliver. The capacity to express, the capacity to stand your ground, the capacity to have integrity. So, Sthira Sukham Asanam, we begin with Sthira, and the way I like to translate this with an understanding of the sutra is that it means poise. Because poise is that place of standing, but it also suggests balance, it suggests energy, it suggests standing in a way between the opposites, which is a huge concept in our yoga practice. The capacity to stand between the opposites, to not be sucked in to one perspective or of another, to neither fall to the left or the right. So standing between opposites, sthira, standing with poise, standing with openness. So sthiram sukham asanam, the first principle is to stand with integrity, to stand with openness, to stand with responsiveness. The second principle is sukham. And sukham is a wonderful word. We draw the etymology of sukkar, or sweetness, sugar, from that term. And the sweetness is a very specific sweetness. It is the sweetness of the heart. Sukham. Listeners out there may be familiar with its companion term, its polarity term, dukkam. Dukkha means closed, closed space. Sukham means sweet, sweet space. And in this case, we can reference a very specific designation of the word ka. Ka is the space of the heart. It's also the space in the middle of the temple. It's the most sacred space. Just like the space of the heart in the human is the most sacred space. So the simple designation of goodness or good feeling in the tradition is sukha, just like the simple designation of bad feeling is dukkha. Sukham is sweet or open space. Dukkham is closed or bad space. So again, here we see Patanjali drawing on the larger realm of conversation in the yoga tradition at that time, about 5th century, the conversation with Buddhism. In Buddhism, the idea of the space of the heart, where we are familiar with that term, dukkha, is key. And that is a aim that is co-opted by Patanjali. The aim of creating openness in heart space. And we see it here in this sutra. Sthira, standing, poise, openness. Sukham, openness in the heart. A very specific and powerful openness, which leads to the very definition of happiness. Sthira, sukham, asanam. And asanam then, of course, is that capacity for seat. And in this capacity for seat, we understand that it means a deep groundedness, being in the ground. Like these redwoods around me, they all have powerful asanam. They are grounded. Another word for it is apittam, a place where people are seated. So, stiram, sukham, asanam. How do we sit? How do we ground ourselves in a pose? We find poise. We allow openness to work with the body. And we particularly allow openness in the heart, which informs our understanding so that the pose can be stationed, it can be grounded in the best way. It can find its own powerful capacity for seat. Sthira, sukham, asanam. Sutra 246. The second sutra deals with our disposition while we're holding the pose, as my cameraman begins to walk across a bridge and has to hold some poise here. And that sutra is Prayatna Satilya Ananta Samapatibhyam. Prayatna Satilya Ananta Samapatibhyam. And this Sutra 247 is usually translated as by loosening of effort and by concentration on the serpent Ananta, asana is mastered. Sounds a little kooky, right? Why would we focus on a serpent? The idea around loosening effort seems to make sense, but where does the snake come in? We might walk back to one of our introductory lessons where we talked about the definition of the identity of Patanjali, where we identified him with a snake, so maybe there's some reference there. We might think about Kundalini Yoga, where the energy of Kundalini is identified with the snake. An interesting thing to point to, and we did talk about this when we talked about the definition of the name of Patanjali, is that Ananta means space. And if we take Samapatibhyam, which is often translated as meditation, a nice way of glossing it is Samapatibhyam. Pati means to fall, like Patanjali. So we can think of this word in a really, really beautiful story-like pattern. It means complete falling into being. Complete falling into being. So meditation, how is asana, how is asana mastered? Prayatna satilya ananta samapatibhyam, by loosening of effort, focusing on the infinite, ananta, and complete falling into being. So an interesting way to fall out of your asana. A thing we need to perhaps pull apart when we introduce the idea of asana in the context of Patanjali is that this yoga that appeared in 5th century powerfully precedes Hatha Yoga, the practice of asana-focused practice that we look back to today for our practice. That practice comes after the intense experimentations of Tantra, a period of about 700 years of intense experimentation, because Hatha Yoga emerges around the 12th century. So in that period, a lot was learned about the nature of the subtle body and the way energetics work in the subtle body. But more specifically, a lot was learned about the arising of Kundalini and how to engineer that with asana. We, with our modern perspective, can look back through that knowledge that was accrued by Tantra and that knowledge that was developed by the Hatha Yoga tradition that followed it from about the 12th century on, and look at this little pearl of wisdom that we get in the second chapter. And we can guess, with the profound knowledge that Patanjali offered us, that perhaps he also had some insight into the nature of Kundalini. Maybe the science was developed and we didn't have a text that explained it. Maybe Patanjali understood it deeply, but this was neither the place or the time to explain it, because his yoga approach has to do with concentration. It has to do with chitta, the mind stuff. It does not lean on the focus towards Kundalini awakening, which creates a biological upsurgence of energy and concentrates the mind that way. That understanding of Raja Yoga, that is the keenly yoga of the top three chakras, that's really not his focus. His Raja Yoga has to do with concentration. So when he brings us back to this discussion of the asanas, he's not trying to awaken Kundalini, as we might suspect, because he does give us that little clue of Ananta. It's not impossible, but it's definitely not a practice that he elaborates for us. What he elaborates for us is a focus on the heart, Sukha, and a focus on the infinite, Ananta. He gives us meditative navigation points. Those meditation navigation points teach us how to hold the asana. So he's concerned with us getting into it. He's concerned with us holding a prayatna, a certain amount of effort in the midst of it. But that is the kind of meta technology or meta operation that is happening in the midst of asana. Asana itself is not the tool, as will happen in the later practice. So that's my little discussion of those two sutras and our concentration on asana and Yoga Sutra. We'll look at a new topic in the next segment. Thank you for your attention.